I'm Peter Piot, and I'm here, the director, for those who come from outside. And welcome to this World AIDS Day event. World AIDS Day is always a special moment. In the first place, because it's a day that we all together remember all those we've lost, all the people living with HIV, people affected by HIV, and also it's a time to recharge our batteries and to take a cold and hard look at what the last year has given us and where we should go. And that's what this session is all about. It's not so much about the past, but about the future. Next year will be about 3 decades since the first reporting on AIDS in June 1981. I think that some of you were not even born. And who knew at that time how AIDS would change the world, and that in our sophisticated modern times full of technology and Facebook and so on, that we would have a very old-fashioned, to say so, epidemic of an infectious disease, which in the meantime has cumulatively killed about 30 million people. So a first lesson is that anything can happen, and that something similar can happen again. In contrast to what we often thought, particularly in the early days, this is not a short-lived event. Don't count on the fact that one fine day AIDS will disappear, it will go, and that the world will go back to where we were before. It's absolutely clear now today that AIDS is going to be with us for a long time, that even if we've seen recently a few breakthroughs, I would say, in terms of biomedical prevention methods, that we should, as societies, learn how to live with HIV, not accept that people become infected and people die from AIDS, but think through how we do that. And about 3-4 years ago, well, already 4 years ago, I think now, when there were plenty of speeches about 25 years of AIDS, and I gave a few of them also, but I was thinking, what about the next 25 years? What about the long-term implications of what we are doing? What about the next generations and the people who are born in a world with AIDS and who had never known anything else? And that's the essence of AIDS 2031, a think tank, I could say, which brought together with many people, some of whom are going to talk to us here today, trying to ask the basic question, not only what will the future bring us, because that's very hard to predict. Predicting the future, okay, we all like to do that, but it's always very risky in terms of the accuracy of it. But particularly, what should we do today to have the best possible outcome in the long run when it comes to AIDS? Not what should we do in 2031 to have then the best possible outcome, because what we do today has a long-term impact in one way or another. So that's what this is all about, and I'll ask Heidi to introduce AIDS 2031 and the other speakers, and I'm grateful for all of you for your work on this. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Peter. And thanks all of you for coming. I understand that there's been some weather challenges for a number of people, and we do have some people on the phone listening with us today, and we are videotaping the session so that it'll be available online. And I do have CDs of the book, some advanced copies for those who are interested afterwards. I just wanted to say a couple words on what is AIDS 2031. Peter has already talked a bit about how it got started. AIDS 2031 has evolved since it was launched in January of 2007. It's involved over 500 people around the world in 9 working groups. We had groups on leadership, on financing the response, social drivers, modeling, a special look at countries in rapid economic transition, and that was particularly in Asia, hyper-endemic countries in Africa, science and technologies, programmatic response and communication. And each of these working groups were hosted by different institutions around the world. Today, Justin's here from the Social Drivers Group, which was co-led by the International Center for Research on Women and the Institute for International Development at Clark University. Financing the response was led by a group called Results for Development and Brookings Institution. Jeff Garnet, who's with us today, led the Modeling the Epidemic group out of Imperial College. The special look at countries in rapid economic transition was led by the Asia Regional Office of UNAIDS and Prasada Rao. The Hyper-Endemic Country Working Group was hosted and led by the Nelson Mandela Foundation in South Africa. The Science and Technology Group was co-led by PATH, the Program for Appropriate Technologies in Health, jointly with the Duke Global Institute for Health and Mike Merson. And the programmatic response was led by UNAIDS, and communication was led by a group called Communication for Social Change. And it was a highly decentralized process. The idea was that we really we had lengthy discussions on how much 2031 would be about the process or the product. And we were very strongly felt that this wanted to be an engaging process, and that the process of debate and dialogue and challenging some of the assumptions we had was part of the essence and principle of the work of 2031. And I was coordinating is a challenging word because each group was highly decentralized, but facilitating cross-group communication. We had what we called the steering group, which was the heads of these different groups, which is the key authorship of the book, AIDS Taking a Long-Term View. Peter chaired an international advisory committee, which was a bit of a sounding board outside of these groups. And Dr. Steph Bertozzi, who's now the head of AIDS and tuberculosis at the Gates Foundation, chaired our steering committee. So just to give you a glimpse of the scope of involvement under these groups. And each group very much kept its own modes of interaction. Some had discussions and debates at a community level. Others did analysis at a modeling level or an economic level. It was very mixed methods across the different groups. What has been put out in these last years, aside from the book, there are 31 working papers from the different groups, and they're all online, AIDS2031.org. And most of the working groups have final working group reports. We have special supplements on thematic topics in global public health that will be led by the Social Drivers Group. The modeling group has a special issue, theme issue of STI journal, and then there'll be a special issue in what's called MOSI in the Communication for Social Change journal. And we've had individual papers published in the Lancet Health Affairs, and a number of other places are in process. We did jointly with BBC World a series called Love in a Time of HIV, which featured, really followed young people in 5 different cities, Mumbai, New York, London, Cape Town, and St. Petersburg. What is the experience of a young person living with HIV, dating, marrying, trying to have children, getting a job, trying to find their career aspirations as a musician. In the case of the South African film, they're also all online, and I encourage you to take a look. Great teaching resource also. And the one thing that I think was probably one of the most meaningful, well, everything has a different meaning here, but two things that were incubated during the 4 years of the work of AIDS 2031 are two things that I think, in terms of something that's trying to have a long-term impact. One is a Young Leaders Fund, and it's a fund for small grants for young youth-led entities trying to move and make a difference in AIDS. And the other thing that was inspired and incubated, I should say, in the context of AIDS 2031 is a group called Global Health Corps, modeled a bit like Peace Corps, but very much specific to health around the world, and partnering young people to work in the context of projects around the world. So that's the scope of the type of involvement that 2031 has had beyond the book, which is trying to capture the highlights. At any rate, that's just to give you a bit of context. We can move straight into our first presentation by Jeff Garnet, which I think is the backbone of the future, which is on the modeling. And Jeff, I'll invite.
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you, Peter. And we all want to know what the future holds. Peter said it's going to be very difficult to predict the next 25 years of HIV. And as somebody who's grounded in mathematical modelling and looking at hard epidemiological data, I have to agree with him that I'm much more comfortable looking at the past and trying to understand what's happened. And I probably lack the imagination to look at the very long-term future. But I think in terms of looking at the future of the HIV epidemic, there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from what's happened to the epidemic so far and what tools we have at the moment. What I do know is that the 33 million people who are infected with HIV now will either go on to need treatment or will die of HIV or some other earlier cause. So we have immediately knowledge about what's going to happen to a large part of the population. We're also now in a position with the HIV epidemic that the epidemic is saturating in a lot of populations. It's reached a very high prevalence in many populations, particularly in southern Africa. In others, it's saturated in high-risk groups. In some, there are epidemics emerging. But we have a sense after 8 years of what the epidemic looks like in different regions of the world. And we're seeing that endemic level of HIV. And it will go on with incident infections feeding that endemic level unless we have the tools to prevent people newly acquiring infection. The problem we have is that a large fraction of the work we have looking at effectiveness of interventions is based on biomedical interventions. Where we think we want to change behaviours, it's very, very difficult to show in trials that what works, and hopefully Justin will talk a little bit more about those issues, about understanding what works and beyond individual behaviour change. But I think what we're learning from trials is different from what we're learning by looking at the HIV epidemic, which gives us a good idea about what we need to change to control the spread of the infection. So just to lay out in front what the key message that I personally think came out of the modelling exercise are for the AIDS 2031 is that if we actually look back at the HIV epidemic, we can see positive results emerging of people changing behaviour, populations changing behaviour, and HIV incidence dropping down. But at the same time, our projections of the future numbers show a massively expanding burden of HIV, which needs to be contained. And to contain it, we need to combine our prevention and treatment interventions in a way that we haven't been able to do so far. Improved treatment coverage and those improved prevention activities will contribute to a big reduction in the spread of HIV, but also we will need expanded resources, at least for the next 10 years, hopefully with growing economies over a 25-year period, the resources will be more available. So just to show you some of the illustrations that back up those key messages, we have data coming from a number of countries now where we can see prevalence has declined dramatically over time, and it's declined more than we would expect just from the natural saturation and dynamics of the epidemic. We've seen reductions in risk behaviour. Unfortunately, our epidemiological tools only allow us to see those reductions about 6, 7, 8 years after they've happened. And hopefully, we're seeing other places where these big reductions are occurring. But we have observed success in the past controlling HIV, and we need to learn the lessons from those successes, because these are two of the main projections of the AIDS 2031 modelling group, where we took the 22 countries most affected by HIV and looked at what would happen if we just kept going the way we are now in terms of new HIV infections over time and the number of adults infected with HIV. So we can see that with the epidemic spread, reached a peak, started to decline, which we're very pleased about, but is now at a level that we think is fairly stable, and we get increasing numbers because of population growth and that continued new infections. We believe that based on current efficacy in trials, if we roll out and expand both prevention and treatment over the next 22 years, we can avert 26 million HIV infections. Prevalence won't decline quite as dramatically because we're keeping people alive for longer, so they stay within the population. If we look at what's achieving the reductions, it's both, this is a plot for South Africa of projections for the HIV epidemic, and these projections were done by Kelsey Case and the Futures Institute. We have ART treatment, because it reduces transmissibility of HIV, and the data to suggest that's the case is increasing. And also there's some interesting data in AIDS very recently showing that people on ART seem to reduce their risk behaviour in South Africa as well. We get reductions in new infections caused by ART. The prevention interventions such as adult male circumcision that we know works also can reduce the number of new infections, and combined we get big reductions in the number of new infections. This is a glass half full, glass half empty situation though, because glass half full, this is a massive reduction in numbers of new infections that we can achieve with what we already have. Glass half empty, we've still got 200,000 infections per year caused in South Africa in these best case scenarios, and we need to find further things that change behaviour that go beyond what we're able to show is efficacious in trials of our interventions. Okay, so we think there are many infections. So for example, we think that if we did everything we know we can do, we could avert 5.5 million infections in South Africa. Just to elaborate a little bit more on the effects of the antiretroviral treatment and what can be achieved with that. This is a composite slide showing, based on observations in discordant couples, where we think HIV transmission is taking place. And we think from an HIV-infected person, quite a bit of transmission occurs from the primary infection. Then we have the long latent period where we have low viral loads and low levels of transmission. But then recent data suggests that as you progress to AIDS and a lower CD4 count, you become more infectious until you become ill and have fewer sexual exposures. So by treating people and reducing their infectiousness, if we take the old guidelines of 200, we stop quite a lot of the transmission events. If we take the new guidelines from the WHO and treat people from 350, then we slightly fewer new infections are prevented than just by treating from 200. But the point about this is that at the moment we've got very low, we're doing very, very well with treatment. We've got 5.5 million people on treatment in the world, but that's still very low coverage. We're still not treating all the people that need it. And what we should be trying to do is make sure that we do have treatment access for those people that are in need of treatment. And we can model the results of the impact of treatment on transmission if we get a decent coverage, so 80%, for example, of coverage in those who need it. And we can, in our models, look at what we achieve in terms of reduced transmission. So the blue lines are for what we're currently doing in terms of treating people around a CD4 count of 100. The green line is what we could achieve if we put 80% of people with the 200 CD4 guidelines before they died on treatment, and the red lines are what we can achieve with 350 as our threshold for treatment. And we can see that the treatment itself is reducing transmission by a third in our models. So treatment can contribute a lot to HIV prevention. But if we just expand treatment without the expansion of prevention, the numbers of people HIV infected and on antiretroviral treatment will just continue to grow over the next couple of decades. This is work with Mead Over that does long-term projections, and we can see 2031 numbers are growing, numbers of HIV infected are growing, and the costs for the economy are growing. If we can prevent the spread of infection, though, by increasing our prevention activities, we can get to an HIV transmission where by 2031 the numbers of people on treatment is saturating, the cost in terms of dollars of treating people is saturating, and also because of the economic growth of countries, it will become much more affordable. If we assume that AIDS treatment is going to grow linearly, which it seems to be doing, and economies in Africa are going to grow exponentially as they have been doing, over a 20-year period, by 2031, then our treatment becomes much more affordable. And that's if we're achieving our goals with prevention. If we're not achieving our goals with prevention, then economic growth helps, but it's not going to deal with the massive numbers of people in need of treatment. So we are moving to a situation where HIV incidence is stable, and we do need to combine all the different prevention interventions that we have to reduce incidence of infection, and hopefully Justin can suggest ways in which we can make that even more effective by involving communities and creating structural changes. At the moment, the need for treatment outstrips the availability of treatment. So we can congratulate ourselves on the 5.5 million people treated, but we're still not doing enough. And if we don't expand that treatment, people will die. The good news, though, is that if we can have development over the next 20 years, this problem becomes more manageable. So it's a growing problem, but it's something that we can, over the long term, deal with. Thank you.
I think we'll have a round with questions at the end with all the panel members, so we'll walk through the different talks first. I'd like to now introduce Justin Parkhurst, with many of you probably know, from the London School.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for coming. I guess I'll pick up representing some of the work of one of the other working groups. This is the Social Drivers Working Group, and Jeff very kindly referred to the potential with this look towards the future of perhaps engaging with some of the broader social and structural drivers of HIV infection as a prevention strategy. So I'll talk a little bit about what our group tried to do. We have a working paper as well. Heidi mentioned the AIDS 2031 website. So we have a working paper up on there. A couple, actually. One is several of my figures come from the final report of the group, though. And really, what I'll talk about is how do we conceptualize structural drivers, or social drivers, as they're called? How do we potentially operationalize an approach to engaging with them, and how do we evaluate the work we do when we're trying to engage with them? So just some of the issues raised. In terms of the conceptualization AIDS 2031 was all about this notion of moving from an emergency response to a long-term response. And I think the notion of engaging with the social drivers that are shaping HIV risk has really been growing over the last few years in particular, as we recognize that a lot of prevention initiatives and prevention efforts have really struggled to show results. That doesn't mean prevention doesn't work, as some people say. We do see success in terms of prevention. We see declining HIV incidence rates in population groups at times. The gay communities in the West, in the US and Australia and Western Europe, we saw them responding to HIV and reducing infections. The country of Uganda, which I've done a lot of work on a population-wide level, we saw a lot of reduction throughout the 1990s. You can think of Thailand and its response engaging with sex work. But none of those responses, none of those successes really came about from things that we easily measure in trials or that we can easily identify as a single, simple intervention. So we need to consider the factors that drive HIV vulnerability. A sort of flippant comment that I've made at times to people supporting HIV prevention activities is to ask them, how often in your prevention work do you actually ask people, whom are you having sex with and why? Or do you engage with that issue? For many years, we've just thought, well, raising awareness, providing information should achieve behavior change. At the AIDS conference this year, someone said, the social sciences need to move beyond this notion that awareness will change behavior. To me, that's bad social science. Social and behavioral scientists know that telling people what to do isn't going to change their deeply rooted, socially embedded behaviors, including things like sexual behavior or drug-taking behaviors. So the social drivers group recognizes that patterns of practices, including human sexuality, drug use, are shaped and influenced by broad social factors. The desires we have, the practices we engage with, derive from social organizations, and these are not unilateral variables with causal one-to-one linkages. So human interaction social groups, this underlies the concept of social drivers. One example I work on a little bit is that of poverty and HIV, and if I was to ask for a show of hands, how many people think poverty is a driver of HIV, if people want to put a hand up. This was kind of an idea and a discourse that's often reverberating in the HIV community. But then we see figures like this in James Chin's book, The AIDS Pandemic, where he shows sub-Saharan African countries, HIV prevalence on a graph of per capita GDP. And what do we see? We see the higher income countries in Africa seem to have higher HIV prevalence. So what does that actually mean if we're saying poverty is a driver of HIV? We can then look within individual countries. Here's a graph of HIV prevalence by income for individuals within Tanzania, a national survey ranking people by their household wealth. And we see the highest prevalence rates are in the higher income groups in Tanzania. So what does that mean for this notion of poverty and HIV? Well, I mean, as it turns out, it's not a simple correlation. If we go back to this graph, if we looked at the higher income countries in Africa, like South Africa, Swaziland, Botswana, we'd probably not see the same trend as we saw in Tanzania. In fact, unpublished data I've seen in South Africa seems to say it's the wealthiest in South Africa with the lowest prevalence, but the poorest with the highest. So South Africa has higher income, but seemingly an inverse graph to Tanzania. And then similarly, this changes over time. This is the same sort of data from Tanzania 5 years later. We still see the highest prevalence in the higher income groups, higher wealth groups, I should say here. But what we see is prevalence is falling in Tanzania in the wealthy and rising in the poor. So fundamentally, this question, does poverty or wealth lead to HIV, I would argue from a social driver's perspective, is far too simplistic a question. And I think it leads to incorrect approaches to prevention. Poverty does put people at risk of HIV. We have a lot of data and a lot of evidence showing this. We see cases where food insecurity, reliance on transactional sex because of poverty, these things do drive risk behavior. But wealth and situations of wealth or relative wealth can drive risk behavior for other reasons and in other ways. So fundamentally, I would argue a better question is to ask in what ways and in which context does poverty lead to HIV, and in what ways and in which context does wealth lead to HIV. Let these assessments drive locally tailored poverty or wealth-focused prevention efforts. It also allows us to think about the dynamic and the change over time. How do we resist HIV risk when people are moving from situations of poverty to situations of wealth? Because the risks may be different. The risks associated with wealth may come from migration, mobility, living in an urban residence. The risks associated with poverty may be very different. So we need to look beyond just HIV prevention as an outcome if we're looking at social outcomes as well. And we need to look beyond magic structural bullets. Everyone in the audience, I'm sure, is aware whenever we hear this silver bullet, magic bullet idea that will solve all our problems. Unfortunately, we sometimes see this language applied to structural drivers, that structural interventions will solve our problems, whether it's a poverty reduction intervention, a microcredit intervention, a cash transfer. These things may help some people in certain contexts, but in other contexts it may not affect HIV risk, and we need to look beyond that. And that's because I think many of the social drivers and the way they play out are context determined. And I use this language in contrast to the notion of context specific. And I'll explain what I mean by that quickly. I think there are certain factors which affect risk which are independent of context in terms of how they physically or chemically, biochemically operate. So male circumcision is a physical intervention, which no matter where you live or whom you're engaging with or what your religious or personal views are, if a man is circumcised, he is physically less likely to contract from heterosexual intercourse. Similarly, presence of other STIs, the risk it might put you at is due to a biochemical or a biophysical property, or viral load, as we know. Now, depending on where you live, the humidity, your weight, the context you live in, that might have some impact on how protective or how risky your viral load is. But again, the physical mechanism by which it works is independent of the context. Other things I would argue, especially when we talk about social factors, are context, what I call here, determined. Not just context dependent, but context determined. What it means to be poor or to be wealthy, what it means to be educated, high educated, low educated, what it means to be gay, and what that means for your lifestyle, who you mix with, where you live, what the norms of behavior are. That's fundamentally determined by your context. If we think about the gay male community in North America, for example, and the context in which that was. In the 1950s, being a gay man in the US meant probably not being open about your homosexuality. It probably meant not mixing often with many other gay men because it was so repressed in the society. What we saw in the 1960s and 1970s was a different context. The social context had changed, and therefore the lifestyles associated with being a gay man in the United States changed very radically. Many gay men were living in centers such as New York or San Francisco where they were interacting more with other homosexual men. They were more free and open about their sexuality. Unfortunately, we saw the spread of HIV, and that changed the social context again. By the 1980s and 1990s, the lifestyles associated with being a gay man in the United States changed again. So we can't simply look for correlates between being gay and having HIV, or being wealthy or having HIV, or being educated, and not look at the broader context in which determines what that means and how that plays out for HIV risk. And then similarly, the context will determine the impact of any interventions and how they work, how an intervention message affects you, how microcredit programs either increase your risk or decrease your vulnerability, depending on what it leads to your changing lifestyles, and so on. So that's how we conceptualize it. In terms of how we evaluate it, well, Jeff already hinted at this. It's very hard to evaluate structural interventions in terms of experimental trials or randomized trials, because very often external validity from randomized trials relies on having a context-independent mechanism. We control for context in trials, but if the context is going to explain why or how your intervention works in the first place, this is a real challenge. So what we argue in the AIDS 2031 reports we write is that we need multiple methods. Yes, experimentation is often very important to show the outcomes for immediate or more proximal interventions, but we need much more process and qualitative evaluation to understand the mechanisms of effect. How did that effect come about and why? We need to map out the causal chains to see how changing one social driver may put somebody in another context with potentially new or different risks. And we need historical multi-method case studies to understand real-life prevention successes. If we only look at randomized trials to guide our prevention strategies, we miss every lesson that could be learned from the gay community in North America, every lesson that could be learned from the population in Uganda, every lesson that can be learned from Thailand, because those weren't interventions that could be reproduced easily or were not done in a randomized trial. Finally, operationalization. If this is how we think about social drivers, how do we put it into practice? Well, this is a complicated graph, and I just point you to the report to see more. But fundamentally, it's not about coming up with a list of structural interventions per se. Certainly, some structural interventions can be tested, they can be applied, and we should do evaluations, outcome evaluation, process evaluation. But much of what we argue is that you need to tailor to your conditions, tailor to your local target community, target population. And to do that, you need to follow a series of steps rather than choose off-the-shelf interventions. So the steps here on the left, we talk about first identifying your target population, identifying where you want to work, then trying to find out what's driving risk behavior. What are the key risk behaviors they face? What sort of factors are influencing it? Then you can choose the level of your intervention. Some groups work at community levels. Some groups work more with individuals. Some groups are working at a statewide level. So you could think about different structural interventions you could do at different levels. And then it just moves on. Describe the types of impacts you expect it to have, the causal chains you expect, potential unexpected or unwanted outcomes, design your intervention, and hopefully implement it with proper evaluation to learn how the mechanism is changing as well. And then if we're thinking more broadly about how we do structural interventions, this is a diagram coming out of our the Social Drivers Group final report. And it's this notion, and they present this notion of building, how do we build AIDS resilience, in a sense. When we engage at the social level, we're actually engaging with a lot of other values in terms of how we want our society to be structured, and what we think of as a proper society to live in. Now, there are many ways to prevent HIV, which might be contrary to our other values, and this could be at a structural level too. Isolating people, for example, preventing women from leaving the home without a family member present. This is a very good way to prevent the spread of infectious disease, but many people would argue this is not conducive to our other social values. Similarly, repressing lifestyles which are seen as risky, making them illegal or the like. Now, those are structural interventions that might, on a clinical efficacy level, might prevent the spread of HIV. But if we conceptualize this in terms of a broader notion of what sort of society do we want to develop and live in, many of us would argue this is not an appropriate solution. I think the best framework I use when I think about this comes from the international development community. And that's Amartya Sen's framework when he looks at capabilities and in his book Development is Freedom. If we think of development and pursuit of social outcomes, looking at personal freedom and human capacities, then we can look at how we can structurally approach HIV that builds human capacity to resist HIV within communities that are supportive of HIV prevention. And that's in this diagram where we see individual agency on the left and the center and what are called AIDS-competent communities. So how do we build personal ability to resist HIV as individuals move through life and life's changes, as people move from poverty to wealth, as they move from rural to urban areas, and the different risks it involves. Rather than saying, don't allow people to migrate, don't allow people to develop economically, we don't want to trade off one social goal for another. So how do you empower people to be resistant to HIV? How do you build communities that are resistant to HIV? Reducing stigma, for example, enabling communities to allow people to have their lifestyles openly without a sense of fear and the like. So there are multiple points in which you can intervene structurally in this diagram. And I think I'm out of time, so I'll just put up on the board, this is also in the 2031 working paper, the recommendations of the Social Drivers Group. It's just 6 recommendations, but fundamentally it's about what I talked about today. Knowing your epidemic means more than just the epidemiological situation, but sociological descriptions of how HIV spreads and why. Having more devolved and kind of decentralized planning that allows people to tailor local interventions to specific needs of communities, linking this to budgets that will support it, and then there are larger, broader concerns such as having legal frameworks that are supportive and the like. So I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Let's see. Thanks very much, Justin. I'd like to welcome Alvaro, the Director of the International AIDS Alliance in Brighton.
Good afternoon. I've been asked to speak a little bit about the implications of the report from an NGO perspective, from those groups from civil society that are working on implementing the HIV/AIDS response. And that reminded me, 10 years ago, I can see it clearly, a senior official from DFID that managed one of the largest programs at that time on HIV/AIDS in Africa, Julian, saying, you know, Alvaro, you guys, you NGOs, you're great at advocacy, you're great at implementation, but you cannot work the long term. That was his view, and 10 years later, I think he has a point. So you can imagine my excitement to suddenly be offered to be part of this project, suddenly us that were heavily involved in a rapid emergency response to this epidemic. We're going to have a chance to participate in thinking 25 years ahead and trying to figure out what was going on and what we should be doing differently. And there are a lot of things in the report that I would say we need to be doing differently, whether we take the short term or the long term. They're just about good programming, and we should be doing them by now already. But there are others that are about taking this long-term perspective, and that's what I want to focus on today. And I want to do it because I think it's ironic that this report is launched just 3 days later, 3 days after the UNAIDS global report, the first sentence of which says, we have halted and begun to reverse the HIV epidemic. And I've got already a number of calls saying, What's going on here? Have we halted it? Have we not? What are we thinking long term? So much so that in my response to alliance members calling in from Ukraine, from Africa, asking, what's going on here? Have we halted it? Are we looking long term? What are we doing? I've sent them back the definitions I've been able to find in the dictionary about what halting means, which what I've found says hold still, stop the flow, cause to stop, stop moving, stop from happening or developing. None of which I would say we have done, but I'll let you be the judge at the end of this session when we're looking at long term, what have we halted? What they really mean is that we've lowered the daily new infections. A few years back, we had over 8,000 new infections every day. Now we have 7,000. And that's great, great progress. Nobody should underestimate what it's taken to do that, and especially today on World AIDS Day. How many people have had to die so that we can today say we have reduced new infections from 8,000 a day to 7,000. But let's not forget that it still is 7,000 new infections every day, and that last year 1.9 million people died. And that's why I wanted to come back to this slide that Jeff showed, because as he said, it is a glass half full and a glass half empty. But the point I wanted to highlight is the complementary to the one Jeff highlighted in this slide. He mentioned the 26 million infections we would avert if we were able to scale up the response to the levels that have been considered in the modeling. But let me remind you what it also shows is that we will still have 1 million new infections every year. When my kids are my age, they will say, we've got 1 million new infections every year. Will they think that we've halted something with that reality? So, what do we need to do differently today if we take this long-term perspective? And there are a number of things that are important from an NGO perspective. I would say the first one is what Justin has mentioned. The AIDS 2031 report does highlight that much of what we have done now has been driven by a very short-term, I would say, myopic perspective. In a way, if I look at the Alliance, where I come from, and many other NGOs, the primary focus of the community response has been on advocating and on getting programs off the ground in contexts, in communities where the health infrastructure had collapsed, where there was very little there, and they were reacting to keep their loved ones alive, to keep their partners, their children, keep them alive, and help them die, or now try to keep them alive. That's what we were doing. And in that environment, it was very difficult to address the structural drivers, which were seen and are still seen as much more difficult, a long-term investment, changing community norms or gender relations, addressing the impact of labor or economic structures on men and women. We really have dismissed it and seen it as too long-term to merit investment in this context of my loved ones are dying today. But if one takes on the perspective that AIDS 2031 has taken, all these things make much more sense. In fact, I would argue they're not the only ones that make sense, but they make much more sense than the short-term ones that we were taking, because many of these changes, if they manage to be achieved, are self-sustaining. If you can change social norms, structural norms, they have a way of becoming self-sustaining in a way that individual behavior change doesn't, with a new generation coming up and having to start it all again. So that is one of the big, I would say, changes that the report highlights, which is the value of focusing on structural drivers, on the social drivers of the epidemic. And it does highlight something very important. The report calls for a minimum legal standard, a minimal law reform to achieve a minimum legal standard. A standard that decriminalizes HIV status, HIV transmission, and exposure, and decriminalizes same-sex relationships. a minimal legal standard that guarantees equal rights of people living with HIV, of men and of women. A minimal legal standard that eliminates laws that limit access to health services for marginalized populations, like injecting drug users or sex workers, and that decriminalizes needle exchange and other harm reduction programs. All of that becomes much more of a priority when one can focus on this long term. And I think it provides a very important agenda for the work of those working at community level and at national advocacy. It also calls, and it's one point that I think I'd like to highlight and add to Justin's presentation, for new approaches to research the impact and the cost efficiency of this community level structural driver interventions, something that we must remember as we move forward. Equally, I would say the long-term perspective that the report provides values, again, the investment that needs to be made in building the local capacity, something, again, that the emergency response has put aside, waiting for a better day when we would be able to do that. Well, we need to start doing it now if we're going to have an impact by the year 2031. I was also asked to talk a little bit about the economic analysis, given that I was part of the Costing and Financing Working Group. And the main thing I wanted to highlight was that the work that we did and that the group did does confirm that both HIV prevention and treatment easily satisfy the standards of cost effectiveness that are considered in public health policy in low and middle income countries. However, having said that, it also highlighted the very limited data that we have on real-world, on-the-ground AIDS service interventions and their efficiency, and that the limited evidence that we do have suggests that we could be doing much better, that there are big efficiency gains to be made in the response, and we need to focus on that too. There is, as well, in the report, and it's, I think, the theme of our days, and I'm sure we'll hear it from Peter probably later after me, there's also a call for, if we're going to sustain the epidemic and the response in the way that we need long term, we need a better watchdog function, and we need better ability to monitor results. And I can only say from an NGO perspective, I fully agree with that. And I'm sad to be standing here discussing it at a time when I'm not sure where there's going to be enough political will in the governments to ensure that we continue reporting after the next UN General Assembly, and whether the governments will commit to continued reporting until 2015 as a way of monitoring those results that they want to see from everybody and that we all want to see. Talking about financing without me getting very passionate about the issue is difficult, but I'll give it a try just to present the facts to you. I want to use the slide that comes from the report itself and just present 6 facts that were important for the financing group. The first one is to highlight that, notwithstanding all the attention and the importance that we have placed on international financing for HIV/AIDS, still, the majority of the financing today and the majority of the financing of the AIDS response in 2031 comes from national governments and the pockets of the private citizens in those countries. And I think that needs to be remembered. The second point is that there's a group of middle-income countries, the circle at the bottom left corner, that includes Brazil, China, India, Mexico, Thailand, even Ukraine and Vietnam, that have HIV prevalence of under or around 1%, who should be able, as we look forward, to finance the response on their own. For some of them, because they have large populations, we're talking about big sums. So China and India are no doubt going to have to spend big sums of money on their response. But because they have big economies that are growing quickly, it will only consume a small fraction of national wealth. As the working group highlighted, what is missing in these countries is not fiscal space, but in many cases political space. Political space to invest in marginalized groups that are most affected in these epidemics. And that's why we concluded that if external resources go into these countries, it needs to be targeted to creating that political space for these marginalized groups. We then have a second group of countries in southern Africa that have high prevalence but are also middle-income countries. This group includes Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, Swaziland. Because they have a huge epidemic and a growing economy, the group predicts that they will be able to make a significant contribution to their response up until 2031, but they will still require external support over the next few years as they scale up treatment and prevention in the way that Jeff was showing. They will need external support. They cannot do it otherwise. Similar cost-sharing arrangements will be required for low-income countries with significant epidemics, the likes of Burkina, Cameroon, Ethiopia, and Nigeria. And then there's another group of low-income countries, the ones in the circle up to the right, who face considerable impediments to financing their AIDS epidemics, even 20 or 30 years from now, even with the rates of growth that are predicted for their economy. It is impossible to foresee countries such as Kenya, Mozambique, Uganda, and Zambia able to finance in the long term, in the term that we're talking, 25 years, their response. They will remain dependent on external funding to scale up their response. So what does that mean for a civil society perspective? Well, the group said that this means that we need to develop additional self-generating funding streams that do not rely on traditional sources of AIDS funding. And it's true that AIDS has been good at finding new sources. But this has been my main frustration with the working group and the report, is that it hasn't called more loudly, as this data shows, for a Robin Hood tax that without which we cannot see how this response is going to be financed. The report itself is showing models, is showing an increase in the response that is going to somehow magically be financed. We need to look at it. The sources will not allow that scale up unless we find something like a Robin Hood tax, like a tax on financial transactions that will go to contribute to that scale up. And if a sense of achievement rather than despair is going to mark the 50th anniversary of the first AIDS report, if we're going to ensure that the next 2 decades see the same level of progress in global health that the last decade has seen, we need to find a new source of revenue. And unless somebody can find another source of revenue that can generate 10, 20, $100 billion, then we can have a discussion. If not, the Robin Hood tax is the only mechanism to do that. And finally, I'd like to say 2 words about leadership, because we cannot forget, as Heidi said at the beginning, that 2031, it'll be others that will be leading the response, not the ones that are leading it now. And the long-term view makes that very clear, that unless we invest in harnessing the passion, the intelligence, and the commitment that grassroots responses have shown, we won't have the response that the epidemic needs. Preserving the potential of the AIDS response to inspire that passion and goodwill will be vital in the years to come. Significantly stronger solidarity, greater political courage are needed to move legal and policy barriers, as we mentioned, to explore new funding sources like the Robin Hood tax, and to invest in better science and in researching the effectiveness of our responses. So I would say it's in your hands now, and those of us that have been discussing this need to move aside and let others come up. Thank you.
Thanks, Alvaro, and also for the civil society voice, which I think was very crucial in the cost and financing group. I'll invite our last speaker before our Q&A session, and that's Peter Colenso, who is the head of human development in the policy division of DFID. Thanks.
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you to Peter and Heidi for the invitation to be here today. and thank you to you for coming particularly. I'm not the DFID official that was rude to Alvaro and told him he couldn't take the long-term perspective, but I'm pretty confident I've been ruder to Alvaro in private before. I wasn't part of this report, which gives me two advantages. One is that I can congratulate my fellow speakers who were part of the report, and also Peter and particularly Heidi, on putting together a really great piece of work, and I strongly commend it to you all. The other advantage it gives me of not having been part of it is that I'm going to present stuff that lies outside of the report and invite some broader reflections. I'm going to be brief to allow time for questions, but I want to do three things. I want to first throw out some data on what the world might look like in the future and key aspects of what it looks like now, and try and relate that to the AIDS response in 2031. Secondly, I'll address directly the recommendations of the report, to which we, as the UK government, I think can say that we fully subscribe to them. And thirdly, I'm just going to say very briefly where this new coalition government in the UK is on HIV/AIDS, where I think we are in terms of policy, and what I think we can say in terms of future investment. So the first set of things for which I have slides, I'll be very quick, and I'll be so quick that I might lose some of you, which is also suits me because it's not my data, so I'm not confident to defend it. Huge population increases, that's been brought out in the report. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned here but is in the report is that big expanding orange bit, which is about the proportion of that expanding population who will be sexually active. And that's a key thing that the AIDS epidemic that we need to address in the future. Now, notwithstanding points made by Jeffrey and Justin about links between poverty and HIV/AIDS, which are not as direct, and we can't be in confident as them as we might have thought, the world's poor will shift in terms of where they are situated over the coming years to 2030. Much higher share being in sub-Saharan Africa. There'll also be a shift, and I noted with interest some of the previous slides looking at differences between rural and urban prevalence in a few African countries. We'll see somewhere between 2015 and 2020 a shift from the world's population moving from rural to urban, and that will have an implication for how we handle the epidemic going forward. We'll also see in health terms a much greater burden of non-communicable diseases, which will have implications for how we finance and manage healthcare in the future. We'll also see what will motivate people, what will they think, some of the social and cultural drivers. We might see a more religious world going forward. So what this graph does is it tries to plot people subscribing to the 4 major world religions and what that will look like in the future. Gosh, how extraordinary. This is interesting not only for the number of people who will be subscribing to the religions, but it's also the share. So in 1900, we had about 67% of the world's population subscribing to one of these 4 religions. 2005, about 73%. 2050, projection is around 80%. Now, I'd be very interested, I don't know if Justin or others know, whether there's a correlation between whether people hold religious beliefs and their sexual habits and the transmission of STDs. I'd be interested to know that. I don't know the answer myself. Alvaro talked a bit about where will the money come from. Indeed, the report talks a bit about this. We've seen quite positive growth in sub-Saharan Africa in recent years. The big cluster of particularly green countries there are encouraging. We've also seen some countries struggle with growth, but clearly the majority of financing for HIV/AIDS in the future will come from domestic sources, both public and private. And we're going to need to see sustained growth in order for developing countries and indeed middle-income countries to take on the burden of financing that's required. On the role of aid, we are seeing aid as a significant part of the response, but less significant in external financing terms than some of the other flows which are put down here, particularly private financial flows, both remittances and from foreign direct investment. A new world order. This is projected share of global GDP in 2015. So what we've done here is taken the world map and instead of putting numbers into a pie chart, we put it into a world map to show, according to the size of your country, that's your share of global GDP growth. Things we're familiar with here, the rise of China, India, and it's stark to look at how Africa gets squeezed within this map. Preventable deaths, Africa expands. War deaths, Africa again taking on the vast burden of the problem here. HIV/AIDS. And finally, and this speaks particularly to the issue of the African face and the southern African nature of the epidemic, what this graph tries to do is trace the multiple stresses that particularly Africa is going to be facing, that indeed it faces now and will face in the future. So this plots not only stresses relating to conflict, as in the previous graph, but also water, population, crops, hunger, and some environmental factors. I put this up just to demonstrate that in Africa we've got not only a particular challenge with HIV/AIDS, but we've got a set of challenges that are mutually reinforcing, which is going to make the job that much harder. To move on to the second part of what I wanted to speak about, the report itself. I mean, I think it's a really good report. It's comprehensive in its scope, its significance in its findings, and I think it's eminently readable as well. I'm not a technical expert in HIV/AIDS, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I found the science bits manageable, and even I could understand them, and I recommend it to you all. There's three recommendations that I think we would particularly prioritise, and indeed they've come across in the presentations of my fellow panellists. One is prioritising prevention. That's clearly going to be absolutely critical, and we need to do that better and work out what works and scale up our investment in that area. The second is about Southern Africa requiring an exceptional response. That comes across very clearly in the report. We would fully subscribe to that. And our success in that area is, as Alvaro highlighted, highly contingent upon leadership on this issue in that sub-region. And third, the issue of sustainability, which is absolutely critical, particularly in terms of financing. As we know, the current prices of drugs, although they've declined, it won't be sustainable to achieve significant scale-up of access to treatment with drugs at those prices. The third thing I want to say, and then I'll conclude, is where the UK government is on this. Some of you might have read in the Independent newspaper this morning an interview with Andrew Mitchell, the Secretary of State for International Development, where I think he put across the strong commitment that this government has to HIV/AIDS, which is extremely welcome. What has the government said publicly? It said in the coalition agreement between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives that we will prioritise spending on a number of areas, including HIV/AIDS. I think that's encouraging. We've published a business plan as a department, within which sits a document called the Structural Reform Plan, which has also been published. What we say in that is that we will lay out our future priorities in HIV/AIDS in the spring. The reason why we've said that is because we're undergoing, at the moment, a series of internal reviews of our aid, principally our bilateral investments through our country offices and our multilateral investments, to try and work out how we can achieve the best results at maximum value for money. The outcome of this process will be an allocation of resources by country, multilateral institution, and our other areas, including research and policy. And that will help us look at what is the investment framework for HIV/AIDS and how do we prioritise this going forward. Two other things. We would not look only at our investments in AIDS to solve this problem. That may sound like a trite thing to say, but what I mean by that is we're a large investor in, for example, areas like girls' education, and I would hope that we would invest more in girls' education going forward. It's a critical part of the armoury of instruments we have in addressing this problem. Similarly, we're a large investor in health systems, not only direct interventions in HIV/AIDS, but in health systems as well. We want to work closely with our government and other partners on integrating HIV/AIDS services into health systems work. Our broader work on health systems allows us to address particularly issues like PMTCT. So we will see a continued focus on this going forward. I think also other areas like investments in cash transfers and other social protection instruments that will help reach the poorest people. So I will hope that our investment framework going forward will look not only at HIV/AIDS and also broader health, but also a range of other investments through which we can try and address HIV/AIDS. The final thing I want to say is about the UK's role and about where our ministers are. We did something quite special, and I'm not taking credit for it as a civil servant. I'm paying tribute to our political leadership. At the United Nations in September, we were part of a push by the Secretary-General to elevate the issue of women's and children's health to a level that it hadn't previously seen. And we had a big event, and we generated commitments of about $40 billion, not all of it new, I should point out, but much of it from donor governments, some of it from the private sector and from civil society and others. There's a political impetus there, which I think is significant. It's something that the AIDS movement has done well in recent years, particularly on the back of large investment from the United States. But I hope that we can manage the political economy of this globally to try and generate political leadership, which will in turn flow through to resources, which will in turn flow through to how we allocate those resources and spend them efficiently. That's all I'd like to say. Thanks very much.
I could ask the speakers to come up. We'll have 15-20 minutes for questions and answers. Okay, I just want to thank everyone before we go into our questions, and also just to say if there's one overriding theme we've heard today is about the dynamic and changing nature of AIDS. Peter introduced the session and talked about 4 years ago, it's time to not just look back, but to also look forward. And I think that the panel today was really made a powerful point about the changing nature, and we have to stay vigilant and on top of things. I won't say anything more to use up any more time, but I'd like to open the floor to any questions. Yes.
My name is Kitao, and I work for the International HIV Alliance, and I want to just ask this question to Peter from DFID. And we know over the last couple of years and very recently, we've seen a lot of highlight of what HIV epidemic is impacting on other Millennium Development Goals, specifically on education, on Millennium Development Goal number 5 and number 4, which have to do with child survival and maternal mortality. So my question is, do you see a role of great financing of HIV response to contribute to actual reduction of maternal and child health mortalities and morbidity? Thanks.
I think we do, definitely. Our ministers have come in and they've asked us to do something quite different in the department, the way that we approached policy and the allocation of resources historically. They've asked us to say, how can you achieve maximum results at best value for money? Step away from what you're doing currently and say, this is what I can achieve in Ghana, this is what we can achieve in Zimbabwe, this is what we can achieve through our financing through the World Bank or the European Commission. So we've had this very bottom-up process of our ministers asking our country offices through the bilateral aid review and the bit of our organisation that manages our multilateral financing to say, what results can you achieve? And in doing so, as I said, they've stepped back from the current investment portfolio and focused really squarely on results and value for money. And one of the things that's made us do is look very closely at the linkages, the cross-linkages between investments. Now, that's partly why our ministers have been particularly interested in family planning, for example, as an investment that can have multiple outcomes. It's something that's going to help with the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Certainly, it's something that's going to have broader health benefits, broader social and economic benefits. An article recently from the Centre for Global Development saying the best thing you can do for climate change is not address the carbon emissions short term, it's invest in family planning and girls' education. So we've been asked to identify where we think investments are going to achieve results at good value and where they're going to achieve multiple results. So I think part of what we have done and will continue to do is say, what are the investments, the HIV investments that are going to have broader social and economic returns, and what are other investments that are going to have high returns if we want to reduce the incidence of HIV?
Great. Thanks. We have another 2 questions up.
Hi, I'm Kathleen Wennerden. I am a UK GP and alumni of the school, and I currently work in Acorn Hook, Mpumalanga province in South Africa, where 30% prevalence of HIV. It's a very deprived rural community, no NGOs, no community action, patients presenting as late as CD4 counts of 10 or 1, a pluralistic health system, under-doctored areas. All the South African doctors leave the country, leave the state system. A health system which is incredibly poorly managed. And I'm just glad to hear that strengthening health systems is somewhere still on the agenda, because until you put HIV in a context of strengthening health systems, you're not going to see any improvements. As it is, diabetes, hypertension, non-communicable diseases, all equally treated incredibly poorly. We need to be kind of combining our efforts in including somehow working to strengthen the health systems. South Africa is a middle-income country. I can't see any progress being made currently. That's really a reflection rather than a question, but if there is any response to that, I'd be grateful.
Thanks. Why don't we take the other question, and then if in the response, and thanks for your comment. Go ahead.
My name's Will Nutland. I'm doing a doctorate on looking at the acceptability of pre-exposure HIV prophylaxis amongst gay and bisexual men in London. Since last year's World AIDS Day, there's been 2 major HIV prevention breakthroughs, one being the July release of the Caprisa trial that looked at using tenofovir as a vaginal microbicide amongst women in South Africa, and then just last week the results of the IPREX trial using Truvada as a 1-a-day pill, prevention pill amongst gay and bisexual men and transgendered women. I'd be interested in the panel's view as to whether HIV prevention horizon has changed forever after the release of those trials over the last year.
Great. Yes, why don't I ask Jeff to answer that, and then if Peter or others want to say something?
Thank you. That's an interesting question about the new technologies that we have available. And I think the answer is no, it doesn't change the prevention that dramatically, because these are new technologies that we're going to have to use in combination with the other things that we've been doing. The vaginal microbicide was a 30% efficacy, and obviously we need to confirm that. So it's going to be a tool that combines with other prevention modalities and to try and bring us to a situation where the epidemic's brought under control. The IPREX trial results are very interesting, but then there we're talking about quite an expensive intervention that works on high-risk MSM. We still need to see whether it works in other situations, for example in heterosexuals, but then you've got to try and work out how we're going to use this to the maximum effect efficiently in terms of who's going to be we want to be using pre-exposure prophylaxis. And again, I think it's going to be very much thinking about how it's best prioritised within populations and combined with the other prevention interventions. And so I think these are great new tools to have, but we are going to be having to combine them with our other interventions.
Along these lines, and since Peter mentioned family planning, which is, I agree, is a very important issue in terms of climate change, but we know that having a number of choices of options is extremely important, and so in that sense it will definitely contribute, but we also should look at the data, and there's going to be quite a while between these trials and that the methods will be available. Although these drugs exist, it's not that they're new, and they're already being taken for that purpose, but not necessarily in the best way. But you know probably more about that than I do. On South Africa, I'm not as totally pessimistic as you are. When you look at figures, over 1 million South Africans have now access to antiretroviral therapy. I mean, that 5 years ago, there was less than 100,000 because of the denialist policies of the government, President Becky and his Minister of Health. And I would argue that health systems are not the only answer. I mean, of course, you cannot be against strengthening health systems, and that I consider that as a given. But when you look at HIV infection, diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, the prevention of it has not much to do with health systems. That's what I would argue for. I mean, that's about community norms, about social change, about community action when it comes to influencing sexual behavior. It's about packaged food with less salt, less trans fats, less sugar. It's making sure that the healthy option is the cheap option and the tasty option in terms of food, and it's about building different cities and so on, so that this exercise and all that. I mean, let's not be blinded by health systems because we work here at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, or we're in the medical profession. Particularly when it comes to chronic diseases, for caring for them, yes, we need better health systems, and we need different ones that are equipped for chronic disease. And again, we should make sure that chronic disease management is getting outside the hospitals and outside the clinics in the community. But when it comes to their prevention, that's a lot about social change, and it is about, and that also one can link to climate change. Again, we had here the launch of a fantastic book. I can't remember the title. Ian Roberts, Gluten, what is it? Energy Glut, yes. Where it's all in there if you read it. And he's a much better showman than I am.
Did you have something? Other questions? Yes.
I used to work with the National AIDS Control Department. So my question to the panel is, in India, NGO is involved actively in HIV care control. And considering knowing that the level of corruption that there is in India, so you think in such a setting, having NGO set up is a good idea when so much of money is going into these NGOs and the overall output that's coming is nothing. So what do you feel about?
Okay, being one of the ones that supports the works of NGOs in India. I think your point is there's corruption, which I don't think is specific to the NGO sector. I'm not sure whether that's what you meant. I think you would take it's broader than that. I would say India, that the output is nothing. I wouldn't agree with that bit that you've said. I think India has shown its ability to do a number of things, but it has reached high coverage of marginalized groups, much higher than many other countries, and has created the political space to do that, even if not always reaching it. So I would say there's been some signs that the epidemic is being controlled and that there's some progress, even if I'd agree with you that probably the resources invested should be seeing better results than what it's showing. But again, I wouldn't be totally pessimistic as to the response in India. I would think they've done some pretty good things that others can learn from in terms of particularly reaching sex workers and MSM.
Let's take one last question.
Yes, my question goes to I think the Alvaro, the AIDS Alliance. There was a graph you presented which looked at the proportion of the GDP of the countries that will go into HIV and scale up of what we're talking about. Now, you had 3 groups of countries: the one to the right, the low-income countries, and then the middle-income ones. And then somewhere in between, there are some countries which you term middle income, your Swaziland, your South Africa, etc. But then with the low-income countries, you made a very strong statement saying that you think strongly that they will not be able to do much, or I forgot the word you use, without external help. Now, my question is more to myself, actually, is what do the countries like your Swaziland, your Botswana, etc. are doing differently that the countries in the low section cannot do. So you make your statement that they will need external help. But more to the point for you is whether the modeling we use look at over these years until 2031, what is the proportion of those countries going to contribute domestically to that 3.5% that is needed as overall GDP towards HIV. In other words, if there was a graph presented by the gentleman from DFID, which look at the GDP of some of these African countries, is going to grow. So politically, or from the point of view of NGO like AIDS Alliance, where do we sit in looking at these countries to make sure that their proportion of looking putting money into that overall 3.5 of GDP that's needed for HIV? How does it sit?
Yeah, they're telling me I've got about 30 seconds to answer, but it is quite a straightforward answer. What the group did, and these are figures from the group as opposed to from the AIDS Alliance, was to assume that a 1% of GDP spent on HIV/AIDS was about the limit that you could reasonably expect any country to invest from its own resources, that beyond that it would need external help. So for that first group of countries and countries by South Africa, the calculation is that 1% of GDP would allow the scale-up that the groups were required. But to expect the Ugandan, Kenyans, Zambians to spend between 2 and 4% of GDP on the AIDS response was just not a reasonable assumption. No country does that. And you know, we're discussing in countries like this one reaching 0.7% in terms of external aid of GDP. To think that one country can spend 4% on its own AIDS response just seems unreasonable. So for the group, the cutoff point was put at 1% as to what the group felt it could be reasonably expected versus those that would require beyond 2% for sure external support. And what they're doing differently with the Swazilands is growing the Botswanans from the Swazilands is growing the economy faster. It was an economic thing, not an AIDS response one.
Thanks, everyone, in particular to our panelists. If somebody does want a CD version of the book, I have them here on your way out. Also, I promised I would, for the library, let you know that there is an exhibit there of AIDS posters and historical documents over the years, and I encourage you to look at it, and I have to look at it myself.